Hello and welcome to another Tuesday night fighter practice video. Tonight we're going to continue where we left off last week with practicing for fighting from our knees. Before I begin, I want to make a mention that when you are doing practice from on your knees, make sure you're wearing knee pads so that you can stay down and think about the position comfortably and stay down maneuvering without getting your knees too sore or injured or bruised. It's a great benefit not to be in a rush to get off your knees for when you're thinking about different positionings and how you're going to move about on your knees in your armor. Now, the first topic I want to touch on tonight is movement. Movement when you're on your knees comes in two forms. It can be the movement of your opponent and movement of yourself. Your opponent in the SCA gets to form up against you and you get to choose how you wish to receive them. For example, if my opponent is coming from where you are with the camera, I get to choose if I receive them square on or whether I turn slightly side on. You could go either direction, but I really don't recommend this direction. To receive them, and my opponent has to approach in a straight line. This determines the line of contact and actually has rules about where the opponent is allowed to step from then on. With the foot, their foot traveling towards my back, the furthest they're allowed to place that foot is in line with my center of mass, and their other foot cannot come forward past my two knees here. This means that while they are able to lean and so forth, there is a certain amount of space they have to give me and can't come forward past that. However, the rule is, if I then move once they've come and engaged, I've reset that line of engagement and they can reposition their feet to accept and to move to counter wherever I have moved. It is impossible for the kneeling opponent under the rules to put the standing opponent into an invalid position. So be aware of that. If you are planning on being mobile on your knees, which is not a bad idea, it is quite often useful to swing a knee back to get yourself a better, deeper position when fighting an opponent, that you are thereby changing the place that your standing opponent is allowed to stand legally. Okay, so once you've got a position you want to sit in with your knees, as in, do you wish to go slightly side on or square on, you need to then decide where you're going to be putting your sword. Last week we were talking a bit about how we were going to generate power, keeping our sword nice up in front of us. This is a good position because it's giving us extra protection from downward shots, allowing our shield to be in a slightly different position and hence not blinding us. One of the things that I didn't realize I did until someone pointed out for me is when my opponent, before they've engaged, I actually sit with my sword fairly loose behind my head and then I flick it forward just as they come in to engage. This is a little trick that can help quite a bit because if you give your opponent a standing guard that you feel safe in, your opponent has time while they're out of the range of engagement to think about where they wish to fire to and what lines and angles they wish to use. This gives them the advantage of not having to actually think about their first shot so much because they've already got it picked out and they know where you are and you're not likely to move in that situation. By having your sword back, you're ready to throw with a nice long kind of powered throw or just flick it up to protect your head without giving away a static guard, static position to give your opponent something to aim for or something to throw along to get them some help. The position of the sword when you are actually engaged depends largely on what kind of a shot and a position you're kneeling at. For example, if I'm quite square, I want that sword to come across in a windscreen wiper view above my head. If I'm side on, it comes in and points a fair bit more forward, less of a side-to-side windscreen wiper, and instead you can flick the tip forwards and backwards to cover that downward shot upon the front of your head. Also remember, you still have to protect your back since a standing opponent can usually quite easily sky wrap above you to hit you in the back. For that reason, it's quite nice to be able to train to then do the same kind of windscreen wiper motion behind you to catch those kind of sky wraps. It takes a little bit to be able to judge from your opponent's body position, but it is really useful as part of your general Pell work while on your knees to practice bringing your sword comfortably behind you, comfortably in front of you, and comfortably down onto those sides. So you want to have full flexibility and comfort to basically move that sword right around you and gather shots wherever they may come. The next part of your defense to think about, and in truth, what a large proportion of your defense should be, is your shield. Now, a lot of people, when they're first facing up against a standing opponent, will cover quite hard against their body and bring this sword very tightly down. What this does is it catches you up. It means you can't power forward, as we were discussing last week, and it keeps everything bound up and keeps you restricted, so the number of different shots you are able to throw gets greatly restricted by that positioning. Myself, I prefer to keep a much more open shield position where I keep the shield basically tucked in like so, which gives me much more space in this area to move my sword, to move my hand, to duck, to weave, to move around, and keeps my view quite open. With the shield very flat, it is also very easy to have this corner of your shield pressed, causing that shield to get locked in against your body. When your shield is quite a fair bit more open, someone pushing on that corner has a harder time pushing on it, but also it's a lot larger motion, which you can then push forward and out to kind of roll with the motion to clear, to throw somewhere else on your opponent. If they're coming in to push that hard on your shield, they're dedicating a lot of power and a lot of force to that maneuver, which leaves them open for many other kind of positions. With the shield down here, you may also feel that this section of my body is quite open to some kind of a thrust or a shot. But really, most of my opponents are going to be right-handed, which means they're coming from this rough zone here. That shield is still protecting a large proportion of my body from that shadow effect from any kind of thrust, unless they do a large step sideways. If they're doing a large step sideways, what do? I just slightly change my leg position and I'm once again covered, but I have a lot of space back here to do whatever I want to do. A key factor for fighting from your knees is to try and keep as much space as you can for yourself. As soon as you get too tied up, as soon as your opponent steals all your space, the number of moves and so forth that you can do from down there greatly reduces. So as much as possible, try not to get that shield locked against your own body. Keep it a little bit open, and you'll find that that edge does give you a very nice protection for this offside body. The main shot to be wary of is that flicking up and rolling into the pendulum body there. However, that is quite a slow shot, and you should, with a bit of practice, figure out what it's doing and how it's moving, and you can literally block it by just punching that sword hilt out to catch that sword blade, transfer and throw something else, or just roll as it comes in to throw something else. So, key things to practice while you're down here with the shield and the sword here is, as described previously, we want them both working in tandem. You'll have seen a lot of these kind of maneuvers while I'm down here, where I'm describing punching that shield across to take that body and then throwing or doing some kind of motion. Likewise, if I'm blocking up here, not a terribly great shot, but if they're seriously coming around that side, that allows me to pivot that way and throw a wrap. So what you want to do on the Pell, you want to practice getting that sword and shield, providing overlapping kind of defenses to get you nice protection as you need, and when you block far on one side, be ready to throw on the other side, or if you're going to throw far on one side, be ready to counter-rotate and bring that shield to cover you the best positions you can as you roll through those guards. Now, unfortunately, while everyone's still locked down, it's quite difficult to actually practice them against a real opponent. It isn't, now that the restrictions on having people around is lessening, you can get someone to do a bit of slow work with you and run through what they see as open, but you can also fight against someone that you imagine being there and imagine what positions they might actually try to throw for and how you can counter it. The big important thing is not to get that shield locked up against your body, and also not to blind yourself like that, because that means your opponent will pop out and smack you or move around you somewhere where you're not expecting. Many people feel that once you're on your knees, you've basically lost it. Your opponent's got full movement and can kill you at their whim. That is true if you're fighting against a polearm, where they can literally stand outside of your sword range so you have no chance and poke you to death. However, if your opponent is coming in to within sword striking range, because either they're a pole fighter who's being nice and wants to have a bit of a play, or else a sword and shield fighter, you have a lot of advantage because you have a lot less things to actually protect you. Don't have to worry so much about your legs. Yes, it's still possible to be hit in the leg a second time, which stops you being able to rise up like so. However, the amount of area that they can throw for and the distance to try and get down to the legs is quite difficult. This means that you are quite turtled up, you have a lot of protection, a shield that may have left a large amount of gaps to allow them to take your legs now can cover a much larger percentage of your body. Also, the shade effects of shields and swords can actually be a lot larger now that your opponent is raining blows down on you and can't change the angle greatly, since they are basically all coming down on an angle and not across and up. You can actually, don't lift your guard too much, because then a wily opponent can get under it, but you can to some degree lift things and push out a little bit to provide a little bit more cover, a little bit more shade under your shield or your sword to get you that kind of shadow protection and goalkeeper effect that is often written about. Alright, so that about does it for fighting from your knees. Unfortunately, we can't go into too many more techniques unless we have an opponent to practice out about it, but hopefully that's given you some ideas to practice against the Pell, and also to think about, because you don't want to come into a kneeling position and just blindly go into this turtling guard. It'll get you locked down, you won't be able to fight back, and they will step around and kill you. Anyway, I hope you're all staying safe and having a good one, and I will catch you next week. Cheers.